Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, and we're back for our second silly season special. I like the alliteration there. Do you, Rob?
I always love some alliteration, and I'm feeling very silly today, so let's do it.
And speaking of being silly, what is it we're discussing today that's so silly?
The silly old history of the British Isles from 1945 to around about 1997, trying to cover about 50 years of political, economic, and social history all within an hour. So I will just apologise in advance if I have to use a broad brush when describing some things. We will have to skim over some of the detail about events that people have written entire books about, but I will try and do my best.
I mean, I think that's fine. This is kind of an overview. It is actually at special request via our YouTube comments. So it was, I'm just finding the name of the person. Oh, hang on. This is Abstract Scope, which I believe is our very listener who is in the chat. I hadn't realised. Excellent. That's amazing.
Well, welcome to your personalised podcast.
It's almost like this is specifically for you. Excellent. Yes. So we will press on then. So I believe our first point was war. What is it good for? Or more importantly, what was the impact of World War II on Britain? Pretty bad, I think, would be the short summary. But
yeah,
I mean, but we weren't completely wiped out, so that helps. 1945. I don't know how many people really know this. Like, it's something I didn't study at school, but I am aware of from Wikipedia. But we won the war, and we almost immediately had an election in which Churchill lost. What do you think were some of the reasons behind that?
Well, it's a bit complex, and I understand that it sounds a bit crazy that you're like wartime leader. I think most people, when they think of Britain, might think of Churchill as one of the iconic leaders, lost straight after the war. One of the big reasons behind it was that during the war we had a coalition government, so that was both Conservative and Labour in charge. Essentially, the Conservatives took charge of running the war, and Labour took charge of running things on the home front. So they nationalised industries at home to make sure they could create things for the war. And a lot of people at home thought that Labour had done a really good job of managing things within the country. Now the war was over, you didn't need a wartime leader like Churchill. You needed somebody who could take care of the day-to-day business. And people thought that was Clement Attlee, the Labour leader. They also sort of saw it as a new dawn, the working man. There'd been a lot of class divide in Britain before the war, and during it, it'd been sort of a leveler. It didn't matter if you were upper class, it didn't matter if you were a lord, or it didn't matter if you just grew up in a mining village. All of these people were affected by the war in the same way. They all had to sort of plug together for king and country. So that led to this sort of feeling that, oh right, now's the time of the working class. We can sort of get rid of this. It's our time to be in charge. Also, along with this sort of feeling that it was Labour's time, the Conservatives actually ran quite a negative campaign against Labour, kind of warning of the dangers of socialism. And that was a little bit weird if you think that this was in 1945. It was just before the Cold War had begun. Russia was still our allies, and Russia was, of course, incredibly socialist. So to say that socialism was evil when we just won a war with Russia was sort of a bit of a juxtaposition that the British electorate didn't really believe when the Conservatives were trying to spout the dangers of it. I think if the election had been held sort of 5 years later, when the Cold War was more in full swing, the result might have been different. But anyway, essentially Labour won, and that gave them a mandate to extend those sort of policies that they'd been putting into action in World War II and try and make them work in a peacetime scenario.
And I think there's two things I probably want to briefly mention, because, as I say, I've been reading up on this fairly recently. I think one thing a lot of people, because Churchill is best known for his role in the war, Churchill basically, he was a Conservative, and then he had a period where he wasn't really affiliated with any particular party, so he wasn't liked necessarily by all of the Conservative Party. So that also probably didn't help him. After Neville Chamberlain, Churchill kind of took over because they needed someone who was ready to go to war and could handle that pressure. And Churchill had a lot of contact with the US, and he was previously the first Minister of Defence, I believe, during World War One. So, like, he was the right man for that job. But not only was obviously Labour not a massive fan of him because he wasn't really in Labour, he was kind of either unaligned or a liberal at various points, and so the Conservatives weren't massively for him either. So while he was the right man for the job during the war years when there was a coalition between all of the government parties, it was also a fact that he wasn't super popular within his own church, as it were. Another thing was Labour was relatively new. I think they'd won their first general election just before the war. Is that correct?
Yeah, they'd won it in the 1930s, but it was just one government that was a minority government, so they didn't actually have a full charge of the Commons as they would. So yeah, this was their first big chance of ruling with all the power, as it were.
So following all of that, all of that. So following World War II, we've got this Labour win the election. It's 1945 to 51. Economically, presumably we weren't doing very well. We just spent all our money on a war. There was rationing. Essentially, how did that Labour government, traditionally they're seen as high on spending, how did they deal with that situation?
Well, they called it an age of austerity, and essentially they kept the rationing in place after the war, trying to phase it out when things became more available. But they really struggled with the legacy of World War II, with the fact that the UK was effectively broke, and they didn't have much money to spend on the basics. We were really reliant on aid from both the US and Canada, who both provided us with loans. And then there's also a thing called the Marshall Plan, which was very simply a gift from the US. It was a loan. It was money that you didn't have to pay back. And the Marshall Plan was a scheme put in place by the United States to sort of persuade Western European countries not to turn to communism, because there was a big fear after World War II, and particularly the influence of Russia in Eastern Europe, that many people would look to a communist regime to get them out of the troubles or the potential economic problems that they'd run into. So the US paid a massive sort of like payment out to the UK. I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but I think it was in billions, to make sure that the UK could sustain themselves during this time and not have to go to communism. So on top of this money that they've got, Labour also had a very sort of ideological commitment to nationalisation, which we've already mentioned happened a lot during World War II. You had to nationalise steel industries to make sure they were providing stuff for the government so they could get it out in war. Labour just extended that to make sure that people still had jobs to go into after the war, that they didn't just disappear. They also helped to run sort of national insurance schemes, which was essentially a new tax which would help to pay for systems like pensions or healthcare, which would be set up by the government and paid for, and run by the government. So the biggest policy that was done at this time was the NHS. It was born in this age of austerity to make sure that everybody in the country could be protected, could have access to healthcare. And well, they sort of saw it as a smart economic investment at the time as well, because it meant more people keep on working. It increased the standard of living, all of that kind of jazz. This all ties into an idea of economics at the time, which was called Keynesian economics, because it came from it was the idea of an economist called Keynes. I will preface this by saying I'm not an economist, so this is a very layman's description of how Keynesian economics works. But essentially, his policy was that when the market crashes, the capitalist system, just in general, if you leave it to free market forces, it doesn't provide for those who need it the most. It tends to make the poorest unemployed. And also by doing that, by creating more unemployment, there's little demand for other goods and services, and you get into an economic downward spiral that you can't get out of. As demand decreases, then more people have to become unemployed, and then that just keeps going on and on and on. So the Keynesian economic system essentially creates demand and gives employment through government-managed schemes. So, for example, if we go and build a hospital now, that will both employ people at the moment, it will make sure that people have a long-term healthier life, and that will make sure that we can then have a stronger economy in the future. And hopefully, fingers crossed, the global economy will have recovered by the time that hospital's finished, or at least the demand we've created will have helped the economy recover to the extent that we can afford this hospital. I think for our US listeners, the best comparison is FDR's New Deal policies, which was essentially when he took on some government schemes to employ people in the 1930s to help with the Great Recession there. So that was the economic way that they managed it. It's how, even though they had so little money, you could say that they were wise in their investments, or at least building for the future to make sure that they didn't return to a recession that very easily could have happened after World War II.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, it worked to an extent because everything's fine now. But well, I mean, I say fine, but you know what I mean.
Fine now. That's a bold
everything
statement.
is fine. Everything's fine. It's a very bold statement in post-Brexit Britain. Yeah. I mean, so it sounds like from an economic point of view, with the help of the US, because the US basically had kind of helped improve its station during both world wars, because while it had been involved, being an ocean away meant that it could kind of build up its industry with both wars without really losing it, losing out financially. So I think that's why both times the US ended up, as you say, paying these loans and everything.
Yeah. It also didn't have essentially the structural damage of any of the European nations. They didn't have to rebuild roads. Half of London was, the amount of London that was destroyed in the Blitz was massive, and that's a huge economic cost. But the US didn't have to do that.
So so thanks to the US and some of these policies, it sounds like the economics was actually. I always feel like I'm surprised how quickly we sorted everything out. I mean, obviously there was never going to be a switch. It wasn't going to be suddenly 1945 rationing is over. But it's impressive how quickly we recovered. And as you say, things were brought back in as and when they were more available. So I feel like, well, obviously we weren't around at the time, but I feel like that helps people's perception that things are improving if they're slowly getting things like back. So at the same time, do we want to touch on the how foreign policy was affected? I mean, the war had just ended. Germany was literally split in two. But what was kind of going on in that period straight after the war?
You've got the UK was aligned with the US and France after World War II, essentially because they were the main powers in Western Europe, and the Soviets had greater power in Eastern Europe. As we've already said, the UK is sort of reliant on US money, which immediately makes it more aligned with the US than it would be with Russia, but also there are sort of greater sort of political and cultural ties there. Anyway, the biggest problem was, though, in a UK sense, was that the UK was seen as sort of a minor player in this new Cold War that was developing. If you look at it, just after 1945, there was the Potsdam Conference, which was between the big three leaders of the USA, UK, and the Soviet Union. Stalin was the only one that had remained from the previous Yalta Conference that happened in 1944. Truman had taken over from FDR, but was still seen as a relatively big player. And Truman and Stalin hardly knew who he was, and he was seen as a less serious figure in foreign policy because he hadn't been dealing with that side of things during World War II. Also, for the UK, there's a problem with empire. So we slowly, at one stage, under the Victorians, we'd probably could lay claim to roughly a third of the globe. That started to slip away after World War One, and after World War Two, it became even harder for the UK to justify having an empire abroad. Essentially, you just fought a war with ideals from, breaking away from oppressors and a more liberal idea of how you can run yourself and be more of a democracy. That seemed at odds with the UK's idea of empire.
As I say, essentially, Hitler wants an empire. That's bad. Oh, we have an empire. What's that? What's that you're hiding behind your back, Britain? Oh, it's the Falkland Islands and a number of other countries. Yes.
So there's that, and one of the jewel in the crown, as it was called, India, eventually broke away at this time. It was also really hard for the UK to police an empire as well. It would be really costly to send the UK forces abroad to police anything like that. And there was no sort of desire back at home to do that either. You'd just come out of a grueling war. The last thing you wanted to do was suddenly start a fight halfway across the world to try and keep control of a colony you controlled for ages. So, in very layman's terms, that's why the empire started to slip away. And India was probably which happened during at this time, was probably the biggest and most significant example of a very powerful nation deciding to make itself separate from the UK and become independent.
I mean, it probably the biggest biggest member of the empire by population, I would assume, even then.
Yes. Yeah, by far.
Okay, so we had Labour from 45 to 51, and then we have another general election, right, after 6 years, which is a bit longer than normal, but then we'd had 10 years of kind of not really a normal government during the World War period. So, 10 years without a general election during the World War period.
Sorry, they did have an election in 1950, which
it
Labour
was in 1950.
won.
Okay.
No, Labour won one in 1950, but they called another one in 1951, essentially because there was a split in the Labour Party, and that they forced a general election.
I see. I was wondering if that was a choice, because if so, it seems like an odd one since they then lost.
Yeah.
But right, okay, that makes sense. So the party split, is that when we had the formation of the Lib Dems, or is that later on?
That's late on. I mean, yeah, that's way later on. The Lib Dems. Well, we'll come to that when we come to that.
Right, okay, that's fine. I didn't know. I know it's a split in the Labour Party that led to that, and I didn't know if it was then or later on. They have another election after 5 years. They win. Then there's a split in 1951, and so we have another general election. And probably unsurprisingly, if there's a big split in the party, the Conservatives come back into power. What does that period of time look like?
So essentially, the big point I want to draw from this is that the Conservatives were back in power, but and they'd run an election essentially again saying that we're a united party, which helps to run a country. They'd also sort of criticised some of the austerity politics that were put in by Labour, despite the fact that rationing was slowly ending. There was still a bit of a grind after the war of people thinking this should be over now after 5 years. We should start to be spending a bit more. So the Conservatives lent on that to help them win. But crucially, although they said they wouldn't extend nationalisation, they didn't repeal any nationalisation either. So massive things that have come in, like the NHS, like national insurance, they kept, and they decided that this was the new normal. I think even nowadays, you'd say it was hard that any politician could win in the UK saying that they would abolish the NHS. It seems like a ludicrous thing to say after we've had it for so long. But they'd only had the NHS for 5 years, and there was for 6 years then really, and there was the Conservatives could have, if they'd chosen, try and repeal that system. But it seemed so popular that they chose not to. And you get an age of consensus politics from this point, where the new normal is that we have a level of social security, that we do pay national insurance to help fund healthcare, education, other things like that, and that the NHS would exist. So that's sort of the big political swing. Just to go through some of the key political points. Churchill took back power, but he's sort of seen as old and ailing and not quite with it. I would recommend watching The Crown. Have you seen any of that?
I haven't. It's on my to watch list.
That does a really good job. Actually, I mean, it's dramatized in some ways, but it does a good way of showing you what the political situation was at the time in Britain. He's a Churchill who's not quite the same as he was before the war. He's a figurehead for the party, but all the strings are actually being pulled by Anthony Eden, who's a foreign secretary and seen as very charismatic in the party. And when Churchill eventually decides to stand down, Eden comes to the front.
And during that period, I mean, Churchill is quite ill. He took over during World War II, and he was already in his 60s. And I believe, I'm not sure if it was exactly at that time, but at least by the time he died, he'd had 10 strokes. So, he was not well during that period of time.
Yeah, so that happens and Eden takes over. The big thing I want to focus on here really is the foreign policy situation with the UK. Mm-hmm. So we've already said how the UK is sort of seen as an ailing power compared to the US and Russia. What happens under Eden is something called the Suez Crisis, which is essentially Nasser, who was in charge of Egypt at the time, decided to take over a key canal that was used for trade, the Suez Canal, and this went against a previous peace treaty. The UK thought this was a big breach and they wanted to send forces to the region. The US didn't want to. They thought it would be essentially too destabilizing to the region, and it might force Egypt closer to the Soviet Union. Eden ignores this and goes to war without the consensus of the UN or anything like that. He goes to war essentially almost in secret with French and Israeli forces. And although they get a military victory, the invasion is seen as quite unpopular in the wider international world. It's almost seen as not justified. If you put this in context, they just had the Korean War in 1950, and that was one of the first wars that the UN all came together and said, yes, we decide we'll be on this side and we'll fight for them, and this will be a huge international fighting force between a coalition of different countries. This was really different. This seemed like old-fashioned foreign policy. And ultimately, the US threatened to withdraw funds from the UK if they kept up trying to keep a military presence in this canal. And eventually, the presence was seen as too expensive to the UK. They couldn't justify keeping something there, and they had to withdraw. And after that, as a result, Eden resigned. That was partly due to his own ill health as well, but Suez was certainly seen as a massive embarrassment for the UK. It was so embarrassing because it showed that the UK couldn't act independently anymore. They couldn't just pick a war and fight it by themselves and move on as they had essentially before, when they had control of the empire. They were now really reliant on partners, particularly the US, to provide funding for it. If you can't do that by yourself, you're not a superpower. The US could sustain a war by itself. The Soviets could do the same. The UK couldn't. And with the end of that superpower status, the UK is sort of relegated to a position that it sort of held to this day as a coalition partner with the US.
So a fair amount of soft power, but not so much military power, etc.
Correct, yeah.
So following that, well, we've just lost Anthony Eden, as you say. Do we have a sudden turnover of Conservative leaders? Do we have someone to take over for a short bit? Or I know we moved into Labour in '64,
So we have Harold Macmillan
Yep.
As a Conservative leader who takes over pretty swiftly after, and the Conservatives, like you say, keep power from 1964. So although it was a crisis for the UK in general, it wasn't really a crisis for the Conservatives. They kept it going. One of the big reasons for this was that from the 1950s to about 1969, it's seen as a massive period of relative economic prosperity. So we've already talked about the age of austerity from 45 to 50. Now, in this golden age, the main reason people started to feel good was that unemployment was extraordinarily low at this time, being about 1.9%. The reasons for this was because, that you've got an economy that's mostly nationalized, so the government can guarantee employment for a large percentage of the population. This increases demand, which makes other industries more viable. So that government-managed economy really is focused on making sure people are employed. UK economy is also starting to sort of modernize a little and move away from manufacturing, and as a result of that, you see the sort of a growth of a middle class as people don't have to work in the factories all the time. They've got a bit of insurance. They've got a healthcare system that allows them to, take some time off, but they don't have to work themselves almost, like if you look at the Victorian times, they were working themselves to death. This is like a long time on from that, but they're not having to work to the same extent that they would before the war. They have more time for leisure activities, which of course means more growth in those sort of industries. Rationing came to an end, so people felt freer. And Macmillan said in 1957, quite a famous speech, that he said, "You've never had it so good." And essentially the British public agreed that this was one of the best times to be alive in the UK, particularly if you're thinking that it's 12 years after World War II. People suddenly felt in a relatively short period of time that their lives had got markedly better.
So this is kind of reflected in a similar way to stuff you would see if you're a US listener. This is that time where you see, it's rock music starting up, and you have people going on caravan holidays. In the UK, we have things like Butlins taking off. As you say, it's growth of tourism, a growth of that kind of free time that is often kind of immortalized in postcards, I think. Very, very much, I feel like when you watch any documentary from that period, it's a lot of people walking around in swimsuits, enjoying themselves. Despite the fact Britain is never really that sunny.
Yeah, it was... I think also if you think of just pop culture as well, you mentioned like pop music. The Beatles in the 1960s kind of helped to add to that swinging 60s vibe. England also won the World Cup in 1966. Not that we go on about it a lot.
I mean, all the time, because we've not won anything properly since.
But yeah, and even so Wilson, who was Labour leader from 64 to 1970, took advantage of the World Cup win, essentially called an election rather soon after that World Cup win to sort of capitalise on a feeling of a national high that, yes, we're doing well, Britain's doing well, why don't you vote for the same government again to make us look good? So yeah, I haven't got much more to say on sort of the 50s and 60s, because essentially that's a very potted overview of Britain seen on the up and up. They feel like they're doing well, and as a result, the politics is relatively stable. As I mentioned, you had that that consensus politics. The economic and foreign policy isn't really changing that much between the two parties. They might differ ideologically on a couple of points, but the core direction of the UK is in the same direction from the 1950s to the end of the 1960s.
Before we move on to the 70s, I'm just going to drop in a point here. So 1968, there was equal rights for equal pay going on in Dagenham at the Ford factory, and this was turned into a movie in 2010 and then later a musical. And I think it's interesting because it is rare, I think, to have a kind of pop cult. I mean, so Churchill, famous, like, Churchill's appeared in Doctor Who on an episode set in World War II with the Daleks. But after that, a lot of these prime ministers, people don't really know, because unless they turned up as a spitting image puppet, and even then, listeners any younger than us didn't really see spitting image. I saw a tiny bit of spitting image as a child. It wasn't really on when I was kind of properly growing up. There's not really, I don't think there's this sense of what those kind of prime ministers were like. I feel like, I mean, unless you've studied them directly, I don't think we have this kind of impression of them like we do of Thatcher and other people we'll get to. So it's interesting. I would recommend, I'll put it in the show notes, the song Always a Problem, which is supposed to be, obviously it's a fictionalized version of it, but it's supposed to be Wilson's response to finding out that there's these women striking at this factory over equal pay. And it's him. And it's a very good musical. I would definitely recommend it, having been in it myself. It's a lot of fun. But it's got a good message and a lot of good songs. But that particular one is quite good. And there's I mean, the song is Always a Problem Waiting in the Wings. It's like how, everything we think is going well and there's still a problem for the Prime Minister, So that's a good song. I would just recommend there as a slight aside before we move on to the 1970s.
Cool. Just to add a slight point to what you said about not knowing what prime ministers were like. Wilson was one of the first take advantage of TV that was just starting to come into campaigning. And I think if you look up clips on YouTube, there are some that exist, or have a look at pictures. He's always sort of pictured with a pipe that he literally just had for his sort of TV appearances to make him look more in touch with the working man. That was the thought, that if I have a pipe and I puff on it occasion, that's what the working man will agree, that I am his man and a man of the people in that sense. So weird little things like that, early campaign tricks were starting to come in. So yeah, I'd recommend YouTube and just Googling the party political broadcaster.
So we're going to move on to the 1970s, which you've subtitled The End of the Golden Age. So Wilson goes away. Heath, which was he Conservative again?
Heath's Conservative, yeah.
So 1970, we have Heath for 4 years. How is the Conservative? How is the economic situation changing? We've had this kind of boom through the 60s, and boom tends to be followed by bust. What went wrong in the early 70s?
So one of the big problems is there were a couple of short-term things that we'll go into. So in 1974, you have an oil crisis, and I know this affected the US as well, but it affected the UK quite badly as well, and led to something we call a 3-day week. So essentially, there was only enough energy to power factories for 3 days instead of 5, and that happened under Conservative government, and that shook British confidence quite a bit. If you are unable to sustain production for 5 days and only 3, that really shows that your economic system isn't working. We also had in 1979 something called the Winter of Discontent, which arose when workers went on strike in a number of key industries. Most notable of these being bin men. So there were pictures of rubbish piling up on the street that was left there for months as bin men basically refused to go and pick it up. It shows sort of a real contrast between that and the 60s that had been so promising, to people having to, in the 3-day week, have evenings by candlelight as there wasn't enough energy to keep the lights on. And then in 1979, with even the most basic services not being available. So the reasons for this are more long-term, and many blamed the Keynesian economics that had first led to prosperity were now having the opposite effect. The main problems were excessive trade union power. People being in nationalised industries had joined trade unions, which were used as a force to sort of promote fairer pay for workers, better conditions. All sounds good on the surface, but the problem is that when when the economy started going into recession, the unions still could put pressure on the workers to raise wages when maybe it wasn't the best economic decision. Some businesses may have liked to have made some people redundant in order to keep the factory open. The fact that they couldn't do that, or the fact that they risked upsetting the unions and then that might force them to stop production altogether, meant that there was sort of a slow decline in how much industries could produce. And they were sort of, well, the argument from the right wing and from the right would be that the unions having too much power stopped businesses having the flexibility to hire and fire and adjust wages in line with what the demand was at the time. This was also matched by sort of too much nationalisation. So the government having control over things meant, again, they were less flexible about how they could conduct business. This sort of very rigid economic policy led to them maybe creating artificial demand that the economy just couldn't sustain. We've talked about Keynesianism creating artificial demand that's good at the start, but if you keep on creating that artificial demand and the economy doesn't catch up with you, if it never recovers, then you just can't sustain that. And that's what appeared to be happening through the 1970s. Those on the right might also blame insufficient entrepreneurship. So essentially, if you have a lot of government-controlled businesses, that leads people to sort of not be very entrepreneurial, or they're not encouraged to set up their own businesses that might find a gap in the market because they have the sort of the guarantee of work under the government. And all of this sort of builds together to create an economic system that feels locked in. Both sides of the government still agree that Keynesian economics is the way to run things, but neither of them can really get a handle on it or make it work, with them sort of nudging the needle ever so slightly to the left or to the right. It's striking at this time that the governments of Heath from 1970 to 74, Wilson and Callaghan, were governments that had really, really tiny majorities in Parliament, or in the case of Wilson, they were actually a minority government. So that means they were the largest party in the House of Commons, but all the other parties could theoretically outvote them. So it leads the politicians to having very little power to change much, because the slightest hint of doing anything too radical would lead to rebellion and them losing power.
End of the 70s. Some lots of minority governments back and forth. And the country wants change. They've had enough of this consensus on Keynesian economics. They've decided that's not working. So we need a change in financial policy, maybe less nationalisation. We're going to shake it up. And that leads to a very long period of conservative government, starting with, Thatcher in 1979 comes to power. Our first female prime minister, conservative prime minister. And what was her financial policy? What was it that swung the election in her favour from Labour, other than the fact that Labour had been in power for 5 years at that point? So you often swing back and forth.
Yeah, essentially she offered an alternative approach, breaking away from the Keynesian economics. It was to take government out of the economy and rely on market forces and free trade. This would lead to higher unemployment in the short term, but it was hoped that it would help increase growth over the long term, which would help the economy recover from the recession that it was falling into. She also said that she would remove some power from the unions, which had started to become quite unpopular, particularly with things like the winter of discontent. If there are too many strikes, or they start affecting public services to the point that they don't work anymore, strikes and the unions tend to become less popular than they once were. So Thatcher starts out with this policy, and initially it didn't work. So Britain was seen to be falling into a recession. However, she had a slight saving grace, or at least in her opinion it was. We went to war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. I won't go into much detail now, but essentially it was a very small island off the coast of South America that Britain had claimed to, but Argentina also had some claim. Argentinian forces invaded it, and the UK went out to defend it. When the UK won, it was seen as sort of a big rally round the flag event for the UK. There was a lot of sort of pride that we'd been able to win that war. And because Thatcher was seen as somebody who wasn't afraid to go to war, who wasn't afraid to fight for a British colony that apparently had been attacked sort of like without provocation, that led her to sort of like a big popularity boost. And when she went into the election in 1983, she had quite a big advantage. We've also talked about how we talked about possible splits with Labour before. In 1983, this is where we get the big split in the Labour Party. So
was this before or after the election, just from a timeline perspective?
It's before.
So just before the election, okay.
So before the election, or essentially since Thatcher won in 1979, the Labour Party leader was Michael Foot, who was seen as quite representing the radical left of the party. The biggest problems that made people disagree with Foot was not only that he was so left wing, but also because he committed the Labour Party to a policy of denuclearization, so a ban on nuclear weapons.
And this is height of the Cold War, so
yes,
yeah,
height of the Cold War, so certainly popular amongst a quite passionate proportion of the population, but sort of nationally it was seen as a fairly unpopular policy. So that led some Labour MPs to split and form a new party called the SDP, the Social Democrats, and Labour went into the 1983 election with like a traditional Labour Party, the SDP in the middle, and the Conservatives, who had just won the Falklands War, at least in the public's eyes. Thatcher had been seen responsible for that event. So the result was an absolute landslide to Thatcher. Labour picked up seats in their heartlands, but were pretty much wiped out everywhere else, and the Social Democratic Party flopped. They picked up quite a large percentage of the vote, but because of our first past the post system, which we will go into in later episodes, essentially picked up a handful of seats. So they ended up merging with the Liberals, and that's where you get the creation of the Liberal Democrats as we know them today. So I know you mentioned before, when they've been formed, the mid-1980s, you get the Lib Dems as they are now. With this result, Thatcher finally had the big parliamentary majority, which meant she could really enforce all of her policies with the opposition party unable to stop most things. And this is where you get the big changes. So we've talked about giving nationalisation, like ending nationalisation or reversing it. Big industries like British Gas and British Telecom, which were formerly nationalised industries, were put into the free market. You had stocks and shares. The public could now own them in a different way, and they were forced to compete against other energy companies and other telephone companies. So that's why we still have that's why we still have BT. It's still called BT. It's still British Telecom because it was once nationalised and is no longer. She also took on the unions. So you've got the miners' strike in 84, 85.
Continuing our political musicals theme, that's I believe that's where Billy Elliot is set during that strike.
Yeah. And also, have you seen Pride at all?
I haven't. I've heard good things, but I haven't watched it yet. That's the one set in Wales, right?
Yeah, Pride's excellent. That's actually miles up like the social events of the time from the LGBT community teaming up with miners striking to get both of their causes recognised. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside.
Oh yes, definitely. I appreciate. But for those following along at home, they now have two musicals to go watch.
Yes. So she took on the unions, and although the miners striked for almost over a year, essentially they had to give in. They had to call off the strike so they could feed their families. And although it was done at an extreme human cost, Thatcher broke the back of the unions and reduced their political power immensely. So with government now encouraging industries to break free from nationalisation, without the union power, the economy recovered. Unemployment still stayed relatively high. It tended to be a system that benefited the rich more than the poor, but it led to economic growth. So this sort of continued period of economic growth meant that the Conservatives just kept on winning and winning and winning, and Thatcher, that's how Thatcher stayed in power for 11 years, essentially, by creating a strong economy that a large proportion of the electorate were happy enough with that they'd keep on voting Conservative.
Obviously, the legacy of her time in power affected my childhood, but it's not like I have contemporaneous thoughts about Thatcher. But I get the impression she kind of splits the country, I think, probably based on your political leaning in general. Like, she is generally seen as a important figure in the Conservative Party. People who support Labour tend not to like her. As you say, there's this kind of, the miners' strike is probably a good example of that, where people who are anti-union were probably quite pleased with the result, whereas people who are pro-union and pro the miners would be sad with what happened, especially since it was so protracted. And I imagine, well, I mean, I'm pretty certain people in those communities, still harbour resentment, because we saw some we saw a lot of ding dong, the witch is dead stuff going on when Thatcher passed away, and I think that's very much coming from those kind of communities who, saw her as this evil figure. What was it that essentially led to her demise? Because so we had, as you say, there was economic growth, but then we have Black Monday in 1987 when the stock market crashes, and we also have the poll tax, which all I know about it was very unpopular. So, do you want to fill me in a bit on those?
Yeah, so I know with the poll tax in particular, so the way taxation usually worked is that you have a staggered tax system. So the poorest pay a very low rate of tax, and the richest pay the highest rate of tax because they're the ones who can afford to bear the greatest burden. Thatcher, with the poll tax, stopped that for a while, basically saying that everyone should pay the same fee for their local council. So if you're rich or poor, exactly the same. What this happened is that rich people were very, very happy as they had to pay far less, but the poor were very, very angry that they had to pay exactly the same as the rich, which is a big chunk of their income. And it led to riots. You get the poll tax riots in poor areas of the country. And this was such bad publicity for the Conservatives, and even ideologically for a lot of people in her party, it was seen as a step too far. It was something that just wouldn't be accepted in British politics. And with that, there was a vote of no confidence in Thatcher, and she did win the first round, but decided that so many people had voted against her within her party that it probably wasn't right for her to continue. And that led to her stepping down in 1990.
So, just to be clear, the poll tax was, I've got in the notes it's the same flat rate. I'm not sure I 100% understood you. Was it that everyone paid exactly the same amount, i.e. £500, whatever it was, or was it that everyone paid exactly the same percent of their salary?
Everybody paid exactly the same amount.
Okay,
so £500.
So if you're poor, that's obviously a massive burden, and if you're rich, it barely registers.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have any idea what that was in real money today? Because I think that'd be quite interesting to look at.
No idea. Let's have a look.
I'm just looking it up. Okay, so I can't find Wikipedia article or anything on this, but I have found some forum posts that I will link to. We're going to have a read through, determine how reliable they think they are. But they suggest it was £150 each in 1984?
That would have been before they were brought in. I think the poll tax was brought in 1989.
Okay, so £150 in 1989. Today, well, that would have been about £350 in 2017, because obviously the inflation calculator doesn't take into account this year because we haven't finished it yet. And I'm assuming that's like per month.
I believe so. Yeah, I'm not confident enough to say with any authority.
I don't know, but if it's per month for council tax, that seems pretty high, because that would be more than my council tax is now. By a considerable margin. It would be almost double what I'm currently paying in council tax, because our council tax is based on the banding of the house. So yeah, if you were doing it per person, like the three of us living in this flat we'd be paying 3 times that amount, because that's per head. That's great. Yeah, that is a crazy amount of money when you work it out. So I think that would be...
Essentially, before then, local governments had been funded by... It was levied on houses rather than people. So the value of your house was how much you paid rather than people. So it was seen as unfair from the rich, because they would have bigger houses, and poor people would not have so nice houses, so there would be a difference in rates. So the proposed rate was a per head charge that saw every adult pay a fixed rate amount set by their local authority. And it proved extremely unpopular because you had some large families occupying relatively small houses that saw charges go up considerably, compared to rich people who are living in, like, you could have 2 people living in a mansion and they'd pay less than 4 adults living in a council flat. So that's essentially why it became so unpopular and led to riots, particularly in poorer areas.
I can't be 100% certain. I've used the inflation calculator, I've made some assumptions, and I've looked up a figure that may be dubious on the internet. As far as I can tell, the council tax for the house I'm in now, with 3 people living in it, would be based on £150 per head in 1989, would be £12,772 a year, if we're understanding that it's 150 a month.
Yeah.
Correctly, which is insane, because it's like 1,200 a year or something here, 1,300. So that's like 10 times what our council tax is, and presumably they're also still taxed on their income. So that's just like an insane rise for people. You know, we're not poor, right? So we should be able to take that based on the idea behind the calculation, but we totally couldn't. Like none of us would be able to pay that suddenly if it was such a sudden change. So yeah, that's pretty crazy. So 1990, she leaves. I will put in the spitting image go now link that everyone uses when they talk about Thatcher leaving at that point in time. Which I think at that point most people, maybe I'm wrong because I wasn't at least conscious at that time as a tiny baby. I get the impression most people had enough of her at that point. It wasn't just the problems within the Conservative Party. It was Labour supporters were already against her, and then, as you say, the poll tax made her unpopular even within her own party. So I think people were quite happy to see her go at that point. And we then got John Major, who I think is the first Prime Minister I actually remember.
John Major came in 1990, but there's a general election in 1992. So in 1992, you've now had how many years of Conservative government? 13 years of Conservative government. A very unpopular PM in Thatcher, who's just left, or she left being very unpopular. Everybody expected Labour to go and win. And what happened was that unexpectedly, John Major won with a majority, a relatively sizable majority for what people were expecting. And it really shocked people within the Labour Party that they've been able to lose from such a position of perceived strength. The reason, or at least some of the reasons that they looked for within their own party, was that they had too many old socialist policies that the electorate wasn't quite ready to commit to. So they'd seen a fair bit of growth under Thatcher's free market policies, and to tempt those in the centre ground to go and vote for Labour was going to have to take quite a big shift. So in comes Tony Blair, who essentially leads to a new form of consensus politics with his third way, where he marries up some of the economics of Thatcherism with the social ideals of Labour and calls it a third way. So essentially his idea was to take the best economic parts of Thatcherism, but make sure they had a kinder side to them, that they wouldn't that the economic growth would then be used to fund services for the poor. A very broad brush, but that's essentially what the third way is. One of the biggest ideological commitments he made at the time was abandoning Clause 4. So Labour had a constitution, and Clause 4 essentially committed it to the nationalisation of industries. By Labour abandoning that, that was essentially a symbolic change that suggested that Labour accepted that nationalisation wasn't always the right thing to do, and that accepted that free market economics could have a benefit when used correctly. And the result of that essentially was that as the Conservatives clung to power over the 1990s, they had a few economic disasters, such as so Black Wednesday happened pretty soon after Major had won the general election. The UK was forced to withdraw from the European exchange rate mechanism, which was essentially a mechanism that was tried to keep the pound within a certain limit, so it could match up with the rest of Europe. It couldn't do this, and it saw a big crash in the value of the pound, and people blamed the government for mismanaging the situation and committing to certain European policies to do this. All I was going to say is that matched with Labour's sort of commitment to an economic policy that now more of the country was comfortable with, led to a landslide victory for Labour in 1997. And you've sort of seen over this 50-year time period a change from consensus policies of nationalisation is good to essentially nationalisation is bad. The government should now have less control of the economy. And you may argue, as we alluded to earlier in the podcast, that maybe the needle is swinging back the other way. We've had consensus policies from 1979 all the way to 2018. If the next general election was to go the way of Jeremy Corbyn, I think that would mark quite a big shift back towards that nationalisation idea, or at least a big split in the consensus. Free market is always right.
I mean, again, I'm trying to be conscious of my social media bubble, but there are definitely, I feel like people our age are kind of like who didn't necessarily have nationalisation during our childhood anymore at all. I think there is a tendency for people our age to be going, "Oh, that looks like a good idea," and there's still, but then there's people older than us who are kind of warning, "No, you didn't live through nationalisation." But as we mentioned briefly earlier, how could we reimagine nationalisation from the way it was done in the 70s in a different way? Would that be different? And how would that work? It's not something we can answer here at the end of the podcast. It's not something I think I have enough information to answer right now, but I definitely get the feeling that more people are pro nationalisation than they were before then. Excellent. Is there anything else you want to add before we finish up?
No, that's it. That's that's 50 years of British history done in a nutshell. I feel like I've had everything to say. There's way more depth to have. I think a good series to watch, if you can find it on YouTube or anything like that, is Andrew Marr did a brilliant History of Britain series a few years back. That's a really excellent overview of that time from about post-war to Blair. So if you want to go and explore that in more depth, I'd recommend that.
Excellent. So, I think we'd like to thank our listeners who have been here live during the recording. You can join us on Discord. There'll be a link in the show notes if you want to listen to us recording. We do try and record every other week on a Sunday, but it's not always on a Sunday. But we post that in the Discord server. And we will, as always, you can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us at reddit.r/unparliamentary. You can search for Unparliamentary Language on Facebook, and you can find us on Twitter at unparlpodcast. And of course, our usual plug that if you go to patreon.com/TTSS, you can throw some money our way, which obviously it shows us worth doing the podcast, but also helps us buy a new microphone for Rob, so that you can hear his buttery voice in higher quality, like on our occasional episodes where we record face to face. Yeah, I hope people enjoyed that, and please give us feedback on our special episodes. We'd like to know what you think about these so that we can plan for next year's silly season as well. We will be going back quite shortly to normal stuff, so we've got one more silly season episode, and then I think everyone's back from the recess. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. They're just starting to get back now. You can feel the political world is bubbling up a little bit more, but we'll go into more detail.
Yeah, and you can join us for our next episode. Next silly season special will be on voting systems and elections. I think we both have some opinions on that, and we'll discuss at length the various types of things. We've mentioned first past the post a few times. We're going to go into more depth on how those different systems work and what systems we think should be used instead, essentially. And I think, it's time for us to go now. So it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him. Bye.
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 Oh,
wow.
I've never heard that. That's new.
That is new.
I assume our poor listener got that as well, but that's really obvious.
I never knew Craig had a soul before. Now I'm scared.
No, yeah, Craig is alive. Craig has taken over.